The laughter echoed through the marble lobby of Meridian Industries like broken glass, sharp and cutting, each cackling a dagger aimed at the hunched figure, pushing his mop bucket toward the freight elevator. Marcus Chen had heard that particular brand of mockery before, the kind reserved for dreamers who dared to reach beyond their station, for fools who mistook ambition for possibility. "Did you hear?" Jennifer Whitmore's voice carried across the polished floors, her designer heels clicking a staccato rhythm of superiority. "The janitor thinks he's going to buy the factory." She paused for effect, her manicured fingers adjusting the pearl necklace that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. "Apparently, he's been saving up." The air quotes she made with her fingers were like tiny guillotines, severing any dignity Marcus might have clung to. The cluster of executives surrounding her erupted in fresh peals of laughter. Richard Blackstone, the VP of Operations, nearly choked on his artisanal coffee. "What's he going to do, pay in quarters from the vending machines?" His voice boomed across the atrium, bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the industrial complex beyond, the very factory that had become the object of both Marcus's desperate hope and their cruel amusement. But if you're enjoying this story of determination against all odds, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Your support helps us bring you amazing tales like Marcus's journey from janitor to property owner. Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up his neck like a fever, but he kept his eyes fixed on the grimy water in his bucket. The reflection staring back at him was a man worn thin by 63 years of invisible labor, his face mapped with lines that told stories of night shifts and double overtime, of dreams deferred and bills barely paid. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle until his knuckles went white, fighting the urge to defend himself, to explain that his offer wasn't the desperate fantasy they believed it to be. The Meridian Industries factory had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years running. What had once been the crown jewel of the city's manufacturing sector now stood like a rusted monument to better times, its smokestack silent, its parking lot half empty. The board of directors had been bleeding cash trying to keep it operational, and whispers of closure had grown from rumors to inevitability. When the official announcement came that they were accepting offers for the property, Marcus had done something that surprised even himself. He had submitted a bid. Not for the astronomical sum the board had originally hoped for, not even for the reduced price they'd reluctantly considered, but for exactly what Marcus had managed to scrape together over 40 years of living like a monk: $150,000. Every penny he'd saved, every dollar he'd hoarded while his colleagues bought new cars and took vacations, while they laughed at his second-hand clothes and his ancient Honda that looked like it had survived several apocalypses. "I heard he actually showed up to the board meeting," whispered Sandra Hayes from accounting, her voice carrying the delicious scandal of gossip. "Can you imagine walking into that boardroom in his janitor uniform, probably smelling like industrial cleaner, trying to negotiate with Mr. Pemberton himself?" The memory of that meeting still made Marcus's chest tight with phantom anxiety. The mahogany-paneled conference room had felt like a cathedral of power, all leather chairs and oil paintings of dead industrialists. He'd sat at one end of the table that could have hosted a small army, his cleaning uniform suddenly feeling like a costume, while Harold Pemberton and the other board members regarded him with expressions ranging from bewilderment to barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Chen," Pemberton's voice carried the weight of inherited authority and old money, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you must understand that this is a multi-million-dollar industrial facility. Your offer, while quaint, is simply not viable." The word quaint had hung in the air like incense, perfuming the rejection with patronizing kindness. But Marcus had done his homework. He'd spent months researching the factory's financial records, public documents that painted a picture of mounting losses and dwindling prospects. He'd learned about the zoning issues, the environmental concerns, the massive renovation costs that had scared off every legitimate buyer. He'd discovered that beneath the board's polished veneer of confidence lay a growing desperation that they couldn't afford to maintain much longer. "With respect, Mr. Pemberton," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I believe my offer represents the most realistic solution to your current situation. The factory has been on the market for 18 months with no serious buyers. The monthly maintenance costs alone are draining your reserves. My offer may be modest, but it's immediate and it's genuine." The silence that followed had been deafening. Board members exchanged glances like players in a poker game, each trying to read the other's cards. Marcus had seen something flicker in Pemberton's eyes, not respect exactly, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement that this wasn't the rambling plea of a delusional janitor. This was a man who had done his homework, who understood numbers and consequences, who had identified an opportunity where others saw only problems. Now, 3 days later, as the laughter continued to rain down around him like acid precipitation, Marcus pushed his cart into the freight elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The metal doors closed with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo his own exhaustion. In the privacy of those steel walls, he allowed himself a moment of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool chasing an impossible dream. Maybe 63 was too old to reinvent yourself, too late to transform from invisible maintenance man to property owner. The elevator lurched to a stop and the doors opened onto the 3rd floor. His domain, his responsibility, his intimate knowledge of every corner and crevice of this building. He'd been cleaning these halls for 22 years, long enough to know every stain, every scuff mark, every hidden corner where dust gathered like secrets. He knew which bathroom stalls were used most frequently, which offices stayed late enough to leave coffee rings on their desks, which executives threw their crumpled papers toward wastebaskets with the casual arrogance of men who had never had to clean up after themselves. As he began his routine, working his way methodically through the administrative offices, Marcus allowed his mind to wander to the factory itself. He'd only been inside the actual manufacturing facility a handful of times, usually for major spills or maintenance emergencies that required all hands. But he remembered the vast spaces, the towering machinery now silent and covered in protective tarps, the maze of storage rooms and utility closets that honeycombed the building like a metallic beehive. There was something about that place that had always intrigued him, a sense of hidden potential that went beyond its obvious industrial purpose. Maybe it was the way sound traveled through those cavernous spaces, creating echoes that seemed to whisper of secrets. Maybe it was the labyrinthine layout that suggested hidden passages and forgotten rooms. Or maybe it was simply the romantic notion of transformation, the idea that something abandoned could be reborn, that failure could be converted into opportunity. His mop traced lazy patterns across the linoleum as he worked. The familiar rhythm soothed his frayed nerves. This was honest work, work that left visible results, work that mattered even if no one noticed. Every surface he cleaned, every floor he mopped, every wastebasket he emptied was a small victory against entropy, a tiny rebellion against the chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm human spaces. "Marcus," the voice startled him from his reverie. Sarah Jennings, one of the few executives who had ever bothered to learn his name, was approaching with what looked like genuine concern in her eyes. She was younger than most of the management team, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of earnest energy that hadn't yet been ground down by corporate politics. "I heard about your offer for the factory," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I wanted you to know that not everyone thinks it's crazy. Actually, I think it's kind of brilliant." Marcus paused in his mopping, surprised by the unexpected support. "Thank you, Miss Jennings. That means more than you know. Call me Sarah, and I mean it. You've identified something the rest of them missed. This company is bleeding money on that property. Your offer might not be what they hoped for, but it's better than watching it drain the corporate accounts indefinitely." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, I think Pemberton is seriously considering it. He's just trying to figure out how to sell it to the other board members without looking desperate." The information hit Marcus like a small electric shock. He'd hoped, of course, but hope and realistic expectation were two very different things. The possibility that his offer might actually be taken seriously felt both thrilling
and terrifying. "There's a board meeting tomorrow morning. I heard they're going to put it to a vote. Whatever happens, I wanted you to know that you impressed people in that room, even if they won't admit it. You did your homework, you presented your case professionally, and you offered a solution to a problem that's been keeping Pemberton up at night." After she left, Marcus stood alone in the empty hallway, his reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces around him. Tomorrow morning, while he was probably emptying wastebaskets in the executive wing, a group of powerful people would be deciding the trajectory of his life. They would vote whether a janitor's savings life was worth more than their pride, whether pragmatism could triumph over prejudice, whether dreams had any currency in boardrooms where everything was measured in quarterly reports and shareholder value. He resumed his work with renewed purpose, each stroke of his mop a meditation on possibility. If they said yes, if by some miracle they actually accepted his offer, his life would change in ways he could barely imagine. He would own something substantial, something real, something that couldn't be taken away by corporate restructuring or economic downturns. He would finally have the security that had eluded him for 60 decades, the foundation upon which he could build whatever remained of his life. But even more than security, he would have vindication. He would prove that careful planning and patient saving could triumph over inherited advantage. He would demonstrate that understanding a problem intimately was worth more than understanding it theoretically. He would show that sometimes the person closest to the ground sees opportunities that are invisible from the executive suite. The factory loomed in his imagination like a sleeping giant, full of potential energy waiting to be awakened. He wasn't entirely sure what he would do with it if it became his. Convert it to smaller rental units, perhaps, or lease it to startup manufacturers who couldn't afford newer facilities. The important thing was that it would be his to decide, his to transform, his to nurture back to productive life. As the evening shadows lengthened across the office building, Marcus finished his rounds and made his way back to the supply closet that served as his headquarters. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. Tomorrow would determine whether he remained Marcus Chen, the janitor, or became Marcus Chen, the property owner. Tomorrow would reveal whether 4 decades of disciplined saving and careful dreaming had been wisdom or delusion. He locked up his supplies with the same methodical care he brought to everything, then walked to the lobby where his ancient Honda waited in the nearly empty parking lot. The executives had long since departed for their suburban homes and country club dinners, leaving behind only the security guards and the overnight cleaning crew. His people, the invisible army that kept the corporate world functioning while it slept. Driving home through the industrial district, Marcus passed the factory one more time. It stood silhouetted against the darkening sky like a monument to possibility, its windows dark but somehow expectant. In less than 12 hours, he would know if it was destined to become his responsibility, his challenge, his chance at something greater than he had ever dared to imagine. The laughter from the lobby still echoed in his memory, but it had lost some of its sting. Let them laugh, he thought. Let them assume that dreams were the exclusive province of the privileged and the young. Tomorrow, he might just prove them wrong.
Marcus Chen's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., the same jarring electronic shriek that had dragged him from sleep for the past 2 decades. In the darkness of his studio apartment, he fumbled for the snooze button, his arthritic fingers protesting the morning ritual that never seemed to get easier, only more necessary. Today was different, though. Today, somewhere in a mahogany boardroom across town, his fate would be decided by people who measured his worth in quarterly projections and risk assessments. The apartment was a testament to a life lived in the margins, not poverty exactly, but the careful economy of someone who had learned early that security came from saying no to small pleasures in favor of distant dreams. The furniture was functional and worn, rescued from thrift stores and garage sales, maintained with the same meticulous care he brought to his work. A small table served as both desk and dining area, its surface scarred by years of use, but polished to a gentle shine. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph, his parents standing in front of their first restaurant, their faces bright with the hope that had brought them from Guangzhou to this industrial city 45 years ago. The janitor position at Meridian Industries was survival, not choice. Night shift paid better, and fewer people meant fewer opportunities for the casual racism that seemed to follow him like a persistent shadow. "At least the floors don't care what you look like," his supervisor had joked on his first day, not realizing that Marcus had already learned to find dignity in work that others considered beneath them. But Marcus had also learned something else in those years of watching his parents' business slowly die: the importance of understanding systems from the inside out. While his colleagues saw only the surface, gleaming floors and empty wastebaskets, Marcus studied the deeper structures. He learned how the building's ventilation system worked, which offices generated the most profit, which departments were thriving and which were dying. He observed the rhythms of corporate life with the same attention his father had once devoted to understanding customer preferences and supplier relationships. More importantly, he learned to save. Not the casual saving of someone who put aside extra money when it was convenient, but the disciplined, almost monastic saving of someone who had watched a financial disaster consume everything his family had built. Every paycheck was dissected with surgical precision: rent, utilities, food, transportation, and then everything else into savings. He drove a car that other people would have junked, wore clothes until they literally fell apart, ate rice and vegetables while his coworkers ordered takeout. Every dollar saved was a small victory against the chaos that had claimed his parents' dreams. After his parents' deaths, Marcus had learned that security came from discipline, not dreams. He'd briefly tried conventional happiness, dating Linda Morrison, a nurse, who ultimately rejected him for lacking ambition. The irony stung. He was ambitious, just not in ways she recognized. After Linda, he focused entirely on saving and learning, studying the business world through discarded newspapers and annual reports. The knowledge had been purely academic until the day he overheard Harold Pemberton complaining to the board about the factory's mounting losses. Marcus had been emptying wastebaskets in the conference room, invisible as furniture, when Pemberton launched into a frustrated soliloquy about the property's declining value. "We're hemorrhaging money on that facility," Pemberton had said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of repeated failure. "The maintenance costs alone are killing us, and we can't find a buyer willing to pay anything close to what it's worth. At this point, I'm tempted to consider any reasonable offer just to stop the bleeding." That conversation had planted a seed that grew slowly, carefully, over months of research and planning. Marcus spent his lunch breaks in the public library, studying property records and zoning laws. He learned about the factory's history, its construction specifications, its strategic location near both railroad lines and highway access. He discovered that what the board saw as liabilities, the building's age, its need for environmental remediation, its distance from trendy commercial districts, might actually be assets to the right buyer. More importantly, he realized that his 40 years of careful saving had accumulated into something substantial. Not substantial by executive standards, perhaps, but substantial enough to represent a serious offer for a property that no one else wanted. His bank balance, $150,000 earned through 22 years of night shifts and disciplined denial, suddenly looked like opportunity rather than mere security. The decision to make an offer hadn't been impulsive. Marcus had spent 3 months analyzing every angle, consulting with lawyers and accountants, studying comparable properties and market conditions. He approached the project with the same methodical care he brought to his cleaning routine, leaving nothing to chance, accounting for every variable he could identify.
The hardest part had been imagining himself as anything other than what he'd always been. For 4 decades, he had defined himself through other people's expectations: the obedient son who would save his parents' business, the reliable employee who would never cause problems, the humble janitor who knew his place in the world's hierarchy. The idea of stepping outside those boundaries, of claiming something significant for himself, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Now, as he prepared for what might be the most important day of his life, Marcus found himself caught between hope and fear. The hope was intoxicating, the possibility of transformation, of proving that careful planning and patient accumulation could triumph over inherited advantage. But the fear was equally powerful. The fear of public failure, of becoming a cautionary tale about janitors who forgot their place in the world's hierarchy, of losing everything he'd worked for in pursuit of something that might be beyond his reach. His morning routine was the same as always: shower, shave, instant coffee, and a bowl of oatmeal with sliced banana. The ritual was comforting in its predictability, a small anchor of normalcy in a day that might reshape his entire future. He dressed in his work uniform with the same care he always did, making sure the shirt was pressed and the name tag was straight. If today brought disappointment, he would still need to clean floors and empty waste baskets. The work would continue regardless of what happened in the boardroom. The drive to Meridian Industries took him through the industrial district where he'd spent most of his adult life. Dawn was breaking over the warehouses and factories, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made even the most utilitarian buildings look momentarily beautiful. He passed the site where Golden Dragon Restaurant had once stood, now a vacant lot scheduled for redevelopment, and felt the familiar pang of loss mixed with something new. The recognition that his parents' failure had taught him lessons that might finally bear fruit. At exactly 6 a.m., Marcus badged into the building and began his regular routine. The executive offices wouldn't come alive for another 2 hours, which meant he had time to lose himself in familiar work, to find calm in the repetitive motions of cleaning and organizing. But this morning, every task felt weighted with significance. Each floor he mopped might be one step closer to owning the building he'd maintained for 2 decades. Each wastebasket he emptied might be the last time he performed that particular service as an employee rather than an owner. Sarah Jennings arrived early, as she often did, and found Marcus polishing the conference table where his fate would soon be decided. She looked tired, as if she'd spent the night worrying about something beyond quarterly reports and operational efficiency. "How are you holding up, Marcus?" she asked, settling into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. "Nervous," he admitted, continuing to work the polish into the wood grain, "but ready. I've done everything I can do. The rest is out of my hands." "You know, I've been thinking about what you said in your presentation about understanding the property from the ground up. There's something to be said for that kind of intimate knowledge. These other board members see numbers on spreadsheets. You've actually lived with that building, worked in it, maintained it. You know its quirks and possibilities in ways they never could." Marcus paused in his polishing. "Do you really think they'll vote yes?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying her reflection on the glossy table surface. "Honestly, I think it's going to be closer than anyone expects. Pemberton is more frustrated with the factory than he lets on. The monthly carrying costs are significant, and the board has been pressuring him to find a solution. Your offer might not be what they hoped for, but it's better than continued losses." "And the others?"
Mixed. Blackstone thinks you're overreaching, but even he admits that your financial analysis was sound. Whitmore is opposed on principle. She doesn't think it sends the right message for the company to sell to, well, to someone in your position. But Thompson and Rodriguez seem willing to consider it purely from a business perspective. The information was both encouraging and terrifying. A close vote meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant that his entire future would be decided by the personal biases and business calculations of people who barely knew he existed. After 4 decades of careful planning, his fate would ultimately depend on factors completely beyond his control. As the morning progressed and the executive offices filled with their usual occupants, Marcus found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work. Every conversation he overheard seemed to relate to his situation. Every glance from a board member felt weighted with judgment. The building itself seemed different, charged with potential energy that made the air feel thicker, more consequential. At 10 a.m., he watched through the conference room's glass walls as the board members filed in for their meeting. Harold Pemberton looked grim and determined, carrying a thick folder that probably contained Marcus's proposal, along with financial projections and legal assessments. Richard Blackstone appeared skeptical, his expression suggesting he viewed the entire proceeding as an unfortunate waste of time. Jennifer Whitmore looked positively hostile, as if Marcus's offer represented a personal insult to the natural order of things. But Sarah Jennings caught his eye through the glass and offered a small, encouraging smile. Whatever happened in that room, at least one person understood that his offer represented something more than mere financial transaction. It represented the possibility that careful planning and patient sacrifice could overcome the accidents of birth and circumstance. Marcus retreated to his supply closet, the small space that had served as his sanctuary for 22 years. Surrounded by cleaning supplies and industrial equipment, he tried to find the calm that had sustained him through 4 decades of quiet struggle. In less than an hour, he would know whether those decades had been preparation for transformation or simply an extended exercise in self-delusion. The factory loomed in his imagination like a sleeping giant, full of rooms he'd never seen and possibilities he'd barely begun to consider. If the vote went his way, those spaces would become his responsibility, his challenge, his opportunity to create something meaningful from abandonment and decay. If the vote went against him, they would remain forever beyond his reach, symbols of dreams that had proven too ambitious for someone of his humble station. Either way, Marcus realized he would survive. His parents had taught him that much: how to endure disappointment, how to rebuild from ruins, how to find dignity and honest work regardless of other people's opinions. But for the first time in 43 years, he was allowing himself to hope for something more than mere survival. In the conference room across the hall, powerful people were weighing his worth against their preconceptions. Soon he would learn whether dreams had any currency in boardrooms, whether 4 decades of disciplined saving had purchased the right to transformation, whether a janitor's intimate knowledge of failure and persistence could triumph over inherited privilege and conventional wisdom. The answer, he knew, would determine not just his financial future, but his fundamental understanding of what was possible in a world that seemed designed to keep people like him in their assigned places. Today would prove whether the American dream his parents had died chasing was real enough to sustain one more generation of hope, or whether some ambitions were simply too large for the containers that circumstances provided. The conference room door opened at 11:47 a.m. with the weight of a judge's gavel, and Marcus felt his heart stop entirely before lurching back to life with painful intensity. Harold Pemberton emerged first, his face an unreadable mask of corporate composure, followed by the other board members in a procession that seemed to move in slow motion. Marcus pressed himself against the supply closet doorframe, trying to become invisible while desperately searching their expressions for any hint of his fate. Jennifer Whitmore's face bore the satisfied expression of someone whose worldview had been confirmed. Richard Blackstone looked relieved, as if an unpleasant but necessary task had been completed. But Sarah Jennings caught Marcus's eye and offered the smallest of nods. Not celebration exactly, but acknowledgement. The gesture was so subtle that Marcus almost missed it, but when their eyes met, he saw something that made his knees weak with possibility. "Mr. Chen?" Pemberton's voice carried across the hallway with the authority of a man accustomed to delivering life-changing news. "Would you join us in the conference room, please?" The walk across that polished marble floor felt like crossing a chasm. Each step echoed in the sudden silence that had fallen over the executive wing, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Marcus was acutely aware of his janitor's uniform, the chemical smell of cleaning supplies that clung to his clothes, and the way his work boots looked against the pristine flooring. But he kept his spine straight and his chin up, channeling the dignity his parents had maintained even as their dreams crumbled around them. The conference room felt different now, charged with the electricity of decisions made and futures altered. The board members had arranged themselves around the massive table, like judges at a tribunal, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Pemberton gestured to the chair at the foot of the table, the same spot where Marcus had presented his offer 3 days earlier. "Mr. Chen, the board has deliberated on your proposal to purchase the Meridian manufacturing facility. I want you to know that your presentation was thorough. Your research was impressive, your financial analysis was sound, and your understanding of the property's challenges was surprisingly sophisticated." Marcus felt hope and dread warring in his chest. The compliments felt like preparation for disappointment, the kind of gentle letdown reserved for well-meaning but ultimately inadequate efforts. "However," Pemberton continued, and Marcus braced himself for the inevitable rejection, "there were concerns raised about various aspects of your proposal. Miss Whitmore, would you care to elaborate?"
Jennifer Whitmore leaned forward with the predatory grace of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Chen, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, there are serious questions about your ability to manage a property of this scope and complexity. The facility spans 400,000 square feet across 17 acres. It requires specialized knowledge of industrial systems, environmental compliance, zoning regulations, and commercial property management. With all due respect, your background in building maintenance, while valuable, doesn't necessarily prepare you for the challenges of property ownership at this scale." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to sound reasonable and concerned rather than dismissive. But Marcus recognized the underlying message. Know your place. Stay in your lane. Don't reach beyond your station. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, there are liability issues to consider. Should something go wrong, environmental problems, safety violations, structural failures, the legal and financial consequences could be catastrophic. We have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that any buyer has both the resources and expertise to handle such contingencies. Richard Blackstone nodded in agreement. There's also the matter of what this sale would represent symbolically. Meridian Industries has been a cornerstone of this community for 60 years. The manner in which we dispose of our assets reflects on our corporate reputation and our commitment to responsible business practices. Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up his neck. But something else was rising alongside it, an anger that had been building for decades of being underestimated and overlooked. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate your concerns, but I believe you're operating under some misconceptions about both my capabilities and my preparations." He opened the folder he'd been carrying and spread several documents across the table. "I've spent the last 6 months working with industrial property specialists, environmental consultants, and commercial insurance providers. I have preliminary assessments for remediation costs, structural improvements, and regulatory compliance." He slid a thick report toward Pemberton. "This is a comprehensive analysis of the property's condition, prepared by Morrison Environmental Services. As you'll see, the environmental issues are significant but manageable, and the estimated remediation costs are well within my projected budget."
Whitmore's expression shifted from condescension to surprise. She clearly hadn't expected the janitor to arrive armed with professional documentation. Furthermore, Marcus continued, gaining confidence as he moved into territory he'd researched exhaustively, "I've secured preliminary approval for a commercial loan that would cover renovation costs and provide working capital for the first 2 years of operation. Mutual Trust Bank has reviewed my financial history, my business plan, and the property assessments. They're prepared to provide financing based on my demonstrated ability to manage long-term financial commitments." The silence that followed was different from before, less dismissive, more uncertain. Sarah Jennings was fighting to suppress a smile, while Pemberton studied the documents with obvious interest. "What exactly do you plan to do with the property?" asked David Thompson, the CFO, who had remained quiet until now. His question sounded genuinely curious rather than skeptical. "Adaptive reuse," Marcus replied. "The facility's layout makes it ideal for subdivision into smaller manufacturing and warehouse spaces. There's significant demand in this market for affordable industrial real estate, particularly from startup manufacturers and small-scale operations that can't afford newer facilities. My research indicates that I could lease approximately 60% of the space within the first year, with full occupancy projected within 3 years." He pulled out another document. "These are letters of intent from 7 local businesses currently operating out of inadequate facilities. They're prepared to sign leases contingent on basic renovations that would cost a fraction of what new construction would require." Rodriguez, the head of legal affairs, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Have you considered the zoning implications? That property is currently zoned for heavy industrial use, which limits your options for adaptive reuse."
Actually, I've already initiated discussions with the city planning department about reclassification to mixed industrial use. The city is eager to encourage small business development in that district, and they've indicated strong support for adaptive reuse projects that would increase the tax base while preserving the area's industrial character. The boardroom atmosphere was shifting perceptibly. What had begun as a courtesy meeting to deliver a polite rejection was becoming a serious business discussion. Pemberton was taking notes, Thompson was calculating numbers on his tablet, and even Blackstone looked intrigued, despite his obvious reservations. But Jennifer Whitmore wasn't finished. "Mr. Chen, even assuming you've done your homework, which you clearly have, there remains the fundamental question of whether this sale serves Meridian's best interests. We're talking about selling a multi-million-dollar facility for a fraction of its assessed value. What message does that send to our shareholders, our clients, our industry partners?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had been preparing for this moment, the inevitable confrontation with the pride and prejudice that had kept him invisible for 40 decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and barely controlled frustration. "Miss Whitmore, with respect, I think you're confusing what something is worth with what someone is willing to pay for it. That facility has been on the market for 18 months. In that time, you've received exactly 3 serious inquiries, all of which resulted in offers significantly below your asking price. Meanwhile, you're spending approximately $40,000 per month on maintenance, security, insurance, and property taxes for a facility that generates 0 revenue." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "At that rate, you'll spend nearly $500,000 this year alone, just keeping the property from deteriorating further. My offer represents an immediate end to those carrying costs, plus a guaranteed sale price that, while modest, provides actual value rather than theoretical value." "Furthermore," Marcus continued, his confidence building as he moved into territory where his years of observation gave him unique insight, "I believe you're underestimating the reputational benefits of this sale. Meridian Industries would be demonstrating its commitment to community development and small business growth. Instead of selling to another large corporation that might relocate operations or eliminate jobs, you'd be empowering local entrepreneurship and maintaining the facility's role in the community's economic ecosystem."
Sarah Jennings couldn't contain her admiration. "That's actually brilliant positioning. We could frame this as Meridian's investment in the next generation of local manufacturing, supporting small business development while maintaining our connection to the community." Thompson nodded slowly. "The numbers are compelling. Even at Chen's offering price, we'd be significantly better off than continuing to carry the property as a loss center." But Blackstone remained skeptical. "Assuming he can actually deliver what he's promising. Having a business plan is one thing, executing it is another entirely. What happens if his projections are wrong? What if he can't secure tenants, can't manage the renovation costs, can't handle the regulatory compliance? We could end up with a property in worse condition than before, associated with a very public failure." The criticism stung because it touched on Marcus's deepest fears. For all his research and planning, he was still a 63-year-old janitor with no experience managing commercial real estate. The possibility of failure was real, and the consequences would be devastating, not just financially, but personally. "Mr. Blackstone, you're absolutely right that there are risks," Marcus acknowledged. "But I'd like to point out that every successful business venture involves risk. The question isn't whether risk exists, but whether it's manageable and whether the potential rewards justify the exposure." He reached into his folder one more time and pulled out a final document. "This is a performance bond from Continental Insurance, guaranteeing that if I fail to meet specific renovation and occupancy milestones within 18 months, they'll cover the costs of bringing the property up to agreed-upon standards.
It's my insurance policy, but it also protects Meridian's interests in the unlikely event that my projections prove overly optimistic. The room fell silent as Pemberton examined the insurance documentation. Marcus could see the surprise in his eyes. This wasn't the desperate gamble of a delusional janitor, but the carefully structured proposal of someone who understood both the opportunities and the risks involved. Gentlemen, ladies, I think we need to take a brief recess to discuss these new developments. He looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Chen, would you mind waiting outside while we deliberate? The next 20 minutes were the longest of Marcus's life. He paced the hallway outside the conference room, his mind racing through every possible outcome. Through the glass walls, he could see animated discussions, documents being passed around, calculators being consulted. Sarah Jennings appeared to be advocating strongly for something, while Whitmore and Blackstone engaged in what looked like heated disagreement. At 12:43 p.m., the door opened again. This time, Pemberton's expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his posture, a sense of resolution that hadn't been there before. Mr. Chen, please join us. Marcus returned to his seat, acutely aware that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the trajectory of the rest of his life. The board members had rearranged themselves slightly, as if battle lines had been drawn and redrawn during his absence. Mr. Chen, your presentation today has been illuminating. You've clearly invested considerable time and effort into understanding both the opportunities and challenges associated with this property. Your documentation is thorough, your financing appears solid, and your business plan is more sophisticated than any of us anticipated. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain still, to project the kind of calm confidence that these people expected from serious business partners. However, Pemberton continued, there remain significant concerns about your ability to execute this plan successfully. Ms. Whitmore has raised valid points about the complexity of commercial property management, and Mr. Blackstone's concerns about reputational risk are not without merit.
Here it comes, Marcus thought, the polite rejection dressed up in corporate language that would make his dismissal sound like careful consideration rather than class prejudice. Therefore, Pemberton said, the board has decided to make a counter-proposal. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for yes or no, success or failure. A counter-proposal suggested something he hadn't considered: negotiation, compromise, the possibility that these powerful people might actually take him seriously as a business partner. We're prepared to accept your offer of $150,000 for the Meridian manufacturing facility, Pemberton continued, with the following conditions. First, you must demonstrate successful completion of environmental remediation within 6 months of closing. Second, you must achieve 30% occupancy within 12 months and 60% occupancy within 18 months. Third, you must maintain comprehensive insurance coverage that protects both your interests and ours from liability related to the property's industrial history. Marcus felt dizzy with the implications. They were saying yes, with conditions, but yes nonetheless. After 43 years of being invisible, overlooked, and underestimated, these powerful people were offering him to sell him a multi-million-dollar property. Furthermore, Pemberton added, Meridian Industries would like to become your first tenant. We're prepared to lease 15,000 square feet for our parts distribution center at market rates for a minimum of 3 years. This would provide you with immediate cash flow and help establish your credibility with other potential tenants. The offer was more generous than anything Marcus had dared to hope for. Not only were they accepting his bid, they were offering to become partners in his success. The irony was almost overwhelming. The company where he'd spent 22 years emptying wastebaskets was now prepared to help him succeed as a property owner. But even as hope surged through him, Marcus forced himself to think carefully.
These people hadn't become successful by making emotional decisions. Their offer was calculated to benefit Meridian as much as it helped him, and he needed to understand all the implications before committing to anything. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm honored by your confidence in my proposal," Marcus said carefully, "but I'd like to understand the motivation behind Meridian's willingness to become a tenant. Is this purely a business decision, or are there other factors involved?" Thompson laughed, the first genuine expression of humor Marcus had heard from any board member. "Mr. Chen, you've just demonstrated exactly the kind of careful thinking that convinced us to take your proposal seriously. Yes, there are business advantages for us. Our current distribution facility lease expires in 8 months, and your renovated space would actually be superior to our current location at a lower cost. But you're right to assume there are other factors." Pemberton nodded. "Frankly, your success would reflect well on our judgment. If this project fails, it becomes a story about Meridian's poor decision-making. If it succeeds, it becomes a story about our commitment to community development and our ability to identify overlooked opportunities." The honesty was refreshing. These people were offering him a chance not out of charity or social conscience, but because his success would serve their interests as well. It was a business relationship built on mutual benefit rather than condescension, and Marcus found that prospect far more appealing than any gesture of corporate benevolence. "There is one final condition," Whitmore interjected, her voice carrying a note of warning. "This arrangement requires absolute discretion. We don't want publicity about the unusual nature of this transaction. No media interviews, no public statements about your background or our decision-making process. This is a business deal, not a human interest story." The condition stung, because it revealed the shame these people still felt about doing business with someone of his background. But Marcus understood the practical considerations. Corporate boards were risk-averse institutions, and associating their brand with feel-good stories about janitors turned entrepreneurs could create precedents they weren't prepared to handle. "I can live with that condition," Marcus said. "But I do have one request of my own."
The board members exchanged glances. They clearly hadn't expected the janitor to make demands of his own. "I'd like to retain my position here at Meridian Industries during the transition period," Marcus continued. "The factory renovation will take several months, and I'll need the steady income to manage my personal expenses while getting the business established. I'm prepared to reduce my hours and work around my new responsibilities, but I'd prefer not to burn any bridges until I'm confident the new venture is sustainable." The request seemed to surprise them. Sarah Jennings looked impressed. Pemberton nodded approvingly, and even Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "Actually, that's quite sensible," Thompson observed. "It demonstrates exactly the kind of careful risk management that gives us confidence in your business judgment." "Then we have an agreement," Pemberton said, rising from his chair and extending his hand across the polished table. "Congratulations, Mr. Chen. You're about to become a property owner." The handshake was firm and professional, but Marcus detected something else in Pemberton's grip, a grudging respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the meeting. He had walked into this room as Marcus Chen, the janitor, and was leaving as Marcus Chen, the business owner. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that he felt disconnected from his own body. As the board members filed out of the conference room, chatting about legal documentation and closing procedures, Marcus remained seated at the massive table, staring at his reflection in its polished surface. In less than 2 hours, his carefully ordered world had been turned upside down. The modest security he'd built for 40 decades of patient saving had been transformed into the foundation for something much larger and more ambitious. Sarah Jennings lingered after the others had left, her expression combining congratulation with concern. "Marcus, I hope you realize what you've just committed to. This is going to be incredibly challenging, and there will be people both inside and outside this company who are rooting for you to fail." "I understand, but I've been preparing for this challenge my entire life, even when I didn't realize it. Every night I've spent cleaning these floors taught me something about persistence and attention to detail.
Every dollar I've saved taught me something about delayed gratification and long-term planning. Every year I've spent being invisible taught me how to observe and understand systems from the inside out. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his new responsibilities settling onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. Besides, failure isn't something I'm afraid of anymore. I've watched my parents' business die despite their best efforts. I've lost the woman I loved because my ambitions didn't match her expectations. I've spent 43 years being underestimated and overlooked. If this venture fails, I'll still have learned something valuable about what's possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations. As Marcus walked out of the conference room for what might be the last time as an employee rather than a business partner, he felt the building around him shifting in his perception. The floors he'd mopped for 22 years might soon be his responsibility to maintain. The executives who had barely acknowledged his existence were now preparing to become his tenants. The factory that symbolized corporate failure and abandoned dreams was about to become his chance at redemption and transformation. But even as excitement built in his chest, Marcus remained aware that the real challenges lay ahead. Buying the property was only the beginning. Now he had to prove that a 63-year-old janitor could succeed where a major corporation had failed, that intimate knowledge and careful planning could triumph over inherited advantage and conventional wisdom. The first test would come tomorrow when he would walk through his new property as an owner rather than an observer, when he would begin the process of transforming industrial decay into entrepreneurial opportunity. Somewhere in that vast, silent factory lay the future he'd been building toward for 40 decades. A future that would prove whether dreams deferred could still come true, whether it was ever too late to reinvent yourself, whether the American promise his parents had died chasing was real enough to sustain one more generation of hope. 3 weeks after the handshake that changed his life, Marcus Chen stood before the massive steel doors of the Meridian manufacturing facility, holding a set of keys that felt heavier than their physical weight suggested. The closing had been completed that morning in Harold Pemberton's law office, a surreal ceremony of signatures and notarizations that officially transferred ownership of 400,000 square feet of industrial space from a corporate giant to a man who still smelled faintly of floor polish.
The October morning was crisp, with autumn light slanting through the factory's grimy windows and cathedral rays that illuminated dust motes dancing like microscopic celebrations. Marcus had walked past this building countless times over the past 2 decades, but he had only been inside the actual manufacturing areas a handful of times, usually for emergency cleaning after equipment failures or minor accidents. Now, as he turned the key in the lock for the first time as owner rather than employee, he felt the weight of possibility and responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. The main entrance opened into what had once been the facility's bustling reception area. Now it was a tomb of corporate ambition, with reception desks still bearing nameplates of employees who had been laid off years ago. The company directory on the wall listed departments that no longer existed, phone extensions that connected to nothing but silence. Dust sheets covered furniture like shrouds, and the air carried the musty smell of abandonment mixed with the lingering chemical signatures of industrial processes long since halted. Marcus's footsteps echoed through the empty spaces as he made his way toward the main production floor. He'd brought a powerful flashlight and a clipboard with the preliminary renovation plans his contractors had prepared, but mostly he wanted to simply walk through his new domain and begin to understand it as something other than a symbol of corporate failure. Every square foot of this facility now belonged to him, a thought so extraordinary that he had to remind himself repeatedly that it wasn't a dream. The production floor was a cathedral of industrial archaeology. Massive machines stood silent under protective tarps, their purposes mysterious to someone who had spent his career maintaining offices rather than manufacturing equipment. Overhead cranes hung motionless from rails that stretched the length of the building, frozen in positions they'd held since the last shift ended 3 years ago.
The concrete floor bore the stains and scars of decades of industrial activity, oil spots that told stories of machinery breakdowns, score marks from heavy equipment, patterns of wear that revealed the choreography of workers who had once filled these spaces with purpose and noise. But it was the sheer scale that overwhelmed him. Walking from one end of the main production floor to the other took nearly 5 minutes at a normal pace. The ceiling soared 40 feet overhead, supported by massive steel beams that created a geometric pattern against the skylights. This was a space designed for serious manufacturing, for the kind of heavy industrial work that had once been the backbone of American prosperity. Marcus pulled out his renovation plans and began trying to match the contractor's drawings to the physical reality around him. The facility would need to be subdivided into smaller rental units with new walls, updated electrical systems, and modern HVAC equipment. The environmental remediation work was scheduled to begin next month, focusing on asbestos abatement and soil treatment in areas where decades of industrial activity had left their chemical signatures. As he worked his way through the main floor, taking measurements and making notes, he began to develop a more intimate understanding of the building's layout. The facility was arranged in a logical progression, raw materials receiving at one end, various stages of processing and assembly in the middle sections, and finished goods shipping at the opposite end. Even in abandonment, the industrial logic was apparent, the workflow patterns still visible in the arrangement of equipment and the wear patterns on the floors. But it was in the northeastern section of the building, an area his renovation plans designated for small-scale warehouse units, that Marcus first noticed the anomaly. According to his blueprints, this section should have been a straightforward conversion: remove some obsolete equipment, install dividing walls, upgrade the electrical service. But as he walked through the actual space, he realized that the physical reality didn't match the architectural drawings. There was an interior wall that wasn't shown on any of his plans, a concrete barrier that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. It ran roughly 30 feet along what should have been open floor space, creating a hidden area behind the main production equipment. The wall was painted the same industrial gray as the rest of the facility, but something about its construction suggested it had been added after the building's original completion.
Marcus's curiosity was piqued. 22 years of building maintenance had taught him to notice discrepancies between official plans and actual construction. Buildings evolved over time, with modifications and additions that weren't always properly documented. Usually these discoveries were mundane: a relocated utility line, a storage closet added for convenience, a wall moved to accommodate new equipment. But this wall was different. It was substantial, clearly built to last, and it created a significant amount of hidden space. More puzzling, there didn't seem to be any obvious way to access whatever lay behind it. Marcus walked the entire length of the barrier, running his hands along its surface, looking for doors or access panels that might not be immediately visible. At the eastern end of the wall, near where it met the building's exterior structure, Marcus found what he was looking for, or rather, what he wasn't expecting to find. Hidden behind a piece of obsolete machinery, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it specifically, was a heavy steel door. It was painted the same gray as the wall, with no markings or signage to indicate its purpose. The door was secured with an industrial lock that looked substantially newer than the surrounding construction. Marcus tried several keys from the massive ring Pemberton had given him, but none fit the mysterious lock. Frustrated but intrigued, he made a note to ask the building's former maintenance supervisor about the hidden area. Every industrial facility had its secrets: utility rooms, storage areas, spaces that served purposes known only to the people who worked there daily. But something about this particular secret felt different, more deliberate, more significant than typical building quirks. He continued his survey of the facility, spending the next 2 hours documenting everything that would need attention before the first tenants could move in. The scope of work was daunting,
but manageable, assuming his contractor's estimates were accurate and his timeline projections realistic. By late afternoon, he'd covered roughly half the facility and filled 12 pages with detailed notes. It was nearly sunset when Marcus found himself back in the northeastern section, drawn once again to the mysterious wall and its hidden door. The late-day light streaming through the skylights created dramatic shadows that made the concrete barrier seem even more substantial, more purposeful. He stood before the locked door, studying it with the methodical attention he'd learned to bring to every maintenance challenge. The lock was a heavy-duty industrial model, the kind used to secure valuable equipment or hazardous materials. But what struck Marcus most was its condition. While everything else in the facility showed the dust and neglect of 3 years' abandonment, this lock looked recently maintained. Someone had been accessing this space, even after the factory's official closure. On impulse, Marcus retrieved a crowbar from his truck. 22 years of building maintenance had taught him that sometimes the direct approach was more efficient than searching for proper keys or authorization. If he was going to renovate this section of the building, he needed to know what lay behind that wall. As the owner of the property, he had every right to access every square inch of his investment. The steel door was heavy and well-constructed, but the frame showed signs of age and settling. Marcus worked the crowbar carefully, applying steady pressure rather than brute force. After several minutes of patient effort, he felt the frame begin to give way. With a sharp crack of splintering wood and protesting metal, the door swung open. The space beyond was pitch black, the air stale and undisturbed. Marcus aimed his flashlight into the opening and found himself looking at what appeared to be a storage room roughly 20 feet square. The walls were lined with industrial shelving and the floor was concrete like the rest of the facility. But unlike the main production areas, this space showed signs of recent organization. The shelves were neat, the floor was clean, and there was an almost sterile quality to the environment that contrasted sharply with the dusty abandonment of the rest of the building.
Marcus stepped into the hidden room, his flashlight beam sweeping across the shelving units. Most of the shelves appeared to be empty, but on the far wall he noticed several dozen small wooden boxes arranged with military precision. Each box was roughly the size of a shoebox, made of what looked like expensive hardwood, with brass hinges and small brass nameplates. Approaching the shelves, Marcus could see that the nameplates bore inscriptions that meant nothing to him. Series of letters and numbers that looked like part numbers or inventory codes. But when he lifted one of the boxes, he was surprised by its weight. The container was much heavier than its size suggested, and something shifted inside with a sound like marbles rolling against felt padding. The box's brass latch opened easily, revealing an interior lined with black velvet. Nestled in custom-cut foam padding were what looked like small, clear stones, dozens of them, ranging in size from rice grains to small pebbles. They caught the flashlight beam and fractured it into tiny rainbows, creating points of brilliance that seemed to dance in the darkness. Marcus had seen enough movies and television shows to recognize what he was looking at, but his rational mind rejected the possibility. These couldn't be real diamonds. They had to be industrial crystals, synthetic gems used for some kind of manufacturing process, glass replicas for training purposes. The alternative, that he was looking at a fortune in genuine precious stones, was simply too incredible to accept. But as he examined the stones more closely, lifting one carefully between his thumb and forefinger, Marcus began to recognize qualities that suggested authenticity. The weight was wrong for glass or plastic. The way they caught and refracted light seemed too sophisticated for simple crystal. And most tellingly, when he scratched one against the concrete wall, it left a clear mark while showing no damage itself. With trembling hands, Marcus opened a second box, then a third. Each contained similar collections of stones, all carefully cataloged and preserved in custom packaging. A quick count suggested there were at least 40 boxes on the shelves, each containing what appeared to be genuine diamonds, ranging from small industrial stones to specimens that would be considered significant by any standard.
The implications began to overwhelm him. If these stones were genuine, their value could be astronomical. Even modest estimates of carat weight and quality could put the total worth in the tens of millions of dollars. Marcus found himself sitting heavily on the concrete floor, surrounded by open boxes and scattered diamonds, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. But who had put them here, and why? The hidden room's construction suggested long-term planning, not a hasty hiding place. The careful organization and professional packaging indicated systematic collection rather than random accumulation. This wasn't the work of a single employee hiding stolen goods. It was an enterprise, a deliberate and sustained effort to accumulate and conceal valuable stones. Marcus thought back to everything he knew about Meridian Industries' history. The company had been involved in various manufacturing processes over the decades, including some government contracts during the Cold War period. He remembered hearing older employees mention work on classified projects, military applications that required security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. Could this hidden cachet be connected to some kind of legitimate but confidential work? Or was he looking at evidence of systematic theft? Decades of pilfered inventory hidden away by employees who intended to retrieve it after retirement or during some future emergency. The professional quality of the storage suggested someone with significant resources and long-term thinking, but it could equally represent criminal organization or legitimate but confidential business activity.
As the reality of his discovery began to sink in, Marcus realized he was facing a dilemma that went far beyond the simple challenge of renovating industrial space. These stones, assuming they were genuine, represented a fortune that could transform not only his own life, but potentially the lives of countless others. But they also represented complications he wasn't prepared to handle. If the diamonds were legitimately owned by Meridian Industries, they should have been included in the asset transfer. Their presence in a hidden room suggested either oversight or deliberate concealment. If they were stolen property, possessing them could make Marcus an accessory to theft. If they were connected to classified government work, there could be national security implications that a 63-year-old janitor was completely unequipped to navigate. The sensible thing would be to close the boxes, lock the room, and contact Harold Pemberton immediately. Let the lawyers and accountants sort out the legal and financial implications. Maintain his position as an honest businessman who had simply discovered someone else's secret. But as Marcus sat on that concrete floor, surrounded by more wealth than he'd ever imagined possessing, he found himself thinking about 43 years of being invisible, overlooked, and underestimated. 43 years of watching other people make decisions that affected his life, while treating his opinions as irrelevant. 43 years of careful saving and modest dreams, while others inherited opportunities and advantages. If these diamonds were legitimate Meridian property, why had they been hidden? If they were stolen, who had been the victim? If they were connected to government work, why had they been abandoned when the facility closed? Every possibility suggested that someone had written off this treasure, had decided it was easier to walk away than to deal with the complications of claiming it. For the first time in his life, Marcus held power, information and resources others didn't know about. He could finally make decisions affecting his future without asking permission from people who never respected him. The diamonds glittered in his flashlight beam like captured stars, each stone a small piece of possibility, a fragment of the security and dignity he'd spent 4 decades trying to build through patient saving and careful planning. Before we continue with Marcus's incredible discovery, please hit that like button if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this amazing story unfolds. The hidden room represented more than wealth. It represented the chance to finally escape the limitations that circumstances and other people's expectations had imposed on his life. But it also represented a test of the character his parents had tried to instill in him, the integrity he'd maintained through decades of invisible service and quiet struggle. The easy path would be to rationalize taking the stones,
to convince himself that he deserved this compensation for a lifetime of being overlooked and undervalued. The harder path would be to do what he knew was right, regardless of the personal cost. As darkness fell outside the factory windows, Marcus carefully closed the wooden boxes and arranged them exactly as he'd found them. Tomorrow he would begin the process of investigating the stone's origins and determining their rightful ownership. Tonight, he would go home to his modest apartment and try to sleep with the knowledge that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The drive home through the industrial district felt surreal, as if he were navigating between two different versions of reality. In one version, he was Marcus Chen, the janitor turned property owner, facing the manageable challenges of renovation and tenant recruitment. In the other version, he was the guardian of a secret that could make him wealthy beyond imagination or destroy everything he'd worked to build.
At a red light, Marcus looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and saw the same weathered face that had stared back at him for 63 years. But something in his eyes had changed. For the first time in his adult life, he was looking at a man who possessed real power. The power that came from holding information others wanted, controlling resources others needed, making decisions that could affect not just his own future, but the futures of people whose names he didn't even know. The question that would haunt his sleep was simple but profound. What kind of man would he choose to be now that he had the opportunity to be anything at all? Marcus spent the weekend in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of his normal routine while his mind remained anchored in that hidden room with its impossible treasure. Saturday morning found him at the public library, ostensibly researching commercial property management, but actually diving deep into the history of Meridian Industries, searching for any clue that might explain the diamond's presence in his building. The library's archives painted a picture of a company with deeper secrets than he'd imagined. During the 1960s and 70s, Meridian had held contracts with the Department of Defense for specialized manufacturing applications, a euphemism that covered everything from precision components for military aircraft to industrial processes that remained classified decades later. One particularly intriguing document, a heavily redacted government audit from 1978, mentioned irregularities in materials accounting and concerns about inventory control procedures. By Sunday evening, Marcus had constructed a plausible theory about his discovery. During the Cold War era, Meridian had likely been involved in manufacturing diamond industrials for military applications, cutting tools, drilling equipment, precision instruments that required materials harder than steel. The hidden room could have been a secure storage facility for raw materials or finished products deemed too valuable or sensitive for standard inventory procedures. The timeline fit. The room's construction appeared to date from the 1970s, when defense spending on advanced materials was at its peak. The systematic organization suggested official protocols rather than criminal activity, and the stone's abandonment made sense if the contracts had been terminated abruptly, leaving classified materials in limbo while bureaucrats and lawyers argued over disposition procedures. But theories were one thing, proof was another. Marcus knew he needed professional guidance, someone who could authenticate the stones and help him navigate the legal complexities of his discovery. The question was whom to trust with information that could change everything. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Marcus's modest apartment. Harold Pemberton stood in the hallway outside Marcus's door, looking profoundly uncomfortable in the building's fluorescent lighting and institutional beige paint scheme. He was accompanied by a younger man in an expensive suit whom Marcus didn't recognize. "Mr. Chen, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Pemberton said, his usual corporate composure slightly strained. "We need to discuss something rather urgent regarding your property purchase." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. "Of course, please, come in." His studio apartment had never felt smaller than it did with two corporate executives examining his second-hand furniture and thrift store decorations. Pemberton and Morrison seated themselves carefully on his salvaged couch, while Marcus took the single chair that served as his dining room, office, and occasional reading nook. "Mr. Chen," Morrison began, consulting a thick folder, "we've received some concerning information about your property. It appears that certain materials may have been left behind when we vacated the facility. Materials that weren't included in our asset transfer because we weren't aware of their existence."
The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus felt sweat gathering at the base of his neck, but 43 years of dealing with authority figures had taught him the value of saying nothing until he understood exactly what was being asked of him. "What kind of materials?" Marcus asked carefully. Morrison and Pemberton exchanged glances. It was Pemberton who answered, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering news he'd rather not share. "Mr. Chen, in 1977, Meridian Industries was contracted by the federal government to store and process industrial diamonds for classified defense applications. The contract was terminated abruptly in 1979 due to political changes in procurement policies. At the time, our records indicated that all materials had been returned to government custody. However, a recent audit has revealed discrepancies that suggest some inventory may have remained at our facility." Marcus felt the room spinning slightly, but he maintained his poker face. "And you think these materials might still be on the property?" "We think it's possible," Morrison replied. "The government has contacted us about conducting a thorough search of the facility. Given the sensitive nature of the original contracts, they're prepared to offer significant compensation for any materials recovered." The offer hung between them like a bridge Marcus could either cross or burn. He could admit to finding the diamonds, turn them over to proper authorities, and receive whatever compensation the government deemed appropriate. It would be the safe path, the path that protected him from legal consequences while maintaining his reputation as an honest businessman. But something in Morrison's manner suggested this wasn't purely about recovering lost government property. The lawyer's tension, Pemberton's obvious discomfort, the way they'd approached him at his apartment rather than through official channels, it all suggested a situation more complex than simple inventory recovery. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said slowly, "I'm curious about something. If these materials belong to the federal government, why isn't the FBI or some other agency handling the recovery? Why are you here representing Meridian's interests?" Morrison's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Marcus caught it. When the lawyer finally answered, his words were carefully measured. "The situation involves some jurisdictional complexities. The original contracts contained provisions that made Meridian technically responsible for any materials remaining in their custody beyond the contract termination date. If significant inventory is recovered, both the government and Meridian could face financial and legal consequences." Understanding dawned like a cold sunrise. The diamonds weren't just lost government property, they were evidence of a bureaucratic failure that powerful people wanted to resolve quietly. Meridian had failed to return classified materials properly, creating liability that could cost millions in penalties and legal fees. The government had failed to properly account for valuable resources, creating embarrassment that could affect careers and budgets. Both sides needed the situation resolved discreetly, which meant they needed Marcus's cooperation. And cooperation, Marcus realized, gave him leverage he'd never possessed before. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, rising from his chair with newfound confidence, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I think this conversation needs to happen with my attorney present. I'll have him contact you to arrange a proper meeting." The suggestion clearly surprised them. Morrison actually looked offended that a janitor turned property owner would demand legal representation. But Pemberton nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing that Marcus was demonstrating exactly the kind of careful business judgment that had convinced the board to approve his purchase. After they left, Marcus sat in his small apartment staring at the phone number Sarah Jennings had given him for what she called the best commercial attorney in the city.
For 43 years, he had been reactive, responding to other people's decisions and authority. Now, for the first time, he was in a position to be proactive, to make choices that would determine his own future.
The attorney, Patricia Reeves, agreed to see him that afternoon. Her office occupied 2 floors of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city Marcus had spent his life serving from the shadows. Reeves herself was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from winning battles others were afraid to fight. "Mr. Chen," she said when he finished, "you are sitting on what we call a perfect storm of legal complexity. Government contracts, classified materials, corporate liability, statute of limitations issues, and federal seizure laws all intersect in ways that could keep teams of lawyers employed for years. What does that mean for me, practically speaking?" Reeves leaned back in her leather chair, studying Marcus with obvious interest. "It means you have more leverage than they want you to realize. If those diamonds are authentic and if they're connected to legitimate government contracts, their value could easily exceed $100 million. The government wants them back to close embarrassing audit gaps. Meridian wants them back to limit their liability exposure. But you found them on property you legally own, which gives you significant rights under federal abandoned property laws." The numbers hit Marcus like a physical blow. $100 million, more money than his family had ever dreamed of earning across generations, enough wealth to transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone he cared about. "However," Reeves continued, "the classified nature of the original contracts complicates everything. The government could claim national security interests that override normal property rights. Meridian could argue that the sale price should have been higher if the diamonds had been properly disclosed. And if there's any evidence of criminal activity, theft, fraud, conspiracy, you could find yourself charged as an accessory. So what do you recommend?" Negotiation. All parties have reasons to avoid litigation and publicity. You have something they want, and they have resources you need. The key is structuring a deal that gives everyone enough benefit to justify the compromises required. Over the following week, Reeves orchestrated a complex dance of legal maneuvering that reminded Marcus of the delicate negotiations his parents had once conducted with suppliers and customers. Phone calls were made, documents were exchanged, meetings were scheduled and rescheduled as each party jockeyed for advantage while maintaining plausible deniability about the diamond's existence. The breakthrough came when Reeves discovered that the original government contract contained a provision allowing Meridian to purchase any remaining materials at cost if the contract was terminated. The clause had been forgotten by everyone involved, but it provided a legal framework for resolving the situation without admitting to decades of bureaucratic failure. The final negotiation took place in Reeves' conference room on a gray Thursday morning in November. Marcus found himself seated across from representatives from Meridian Industries, the Department of Defense, and a federal agency whose name was never mentioned, but whose authority was clearly significant. The deal they offered was more generous than Marcus had dared to hope. The government would purchase the diamonds for their estimated value, $147 million, with payment structured to minimize tax consequences. Meridian would waive any claims against Marcus while paying his legal fees as compensation for the inconvenience of the discovery. The federal agency would provide documentation establishing that the materials had been legitimately acquired and legally owned. In exchange, Marcus would sign agreements ensuring that no details of the transaction would ever be disclosed publicly. The official story would be that Marcus had discovered and reported abandoned materials, which were then purchased by their rightful owners at fair market value. No mention would be made of classified contracts, government negligence, or corporate liability. But the most extraordinary provision was one that Reeves had negotiated privately with Pemberton. Meridian Industries agreed to purchase the entire manufacturing facility from Marcus for $50 million, more than 300 times his original investment. The company needed the property back to properly close their books on the diamond situation, and they were prepared to pay handsomely for the convenience of owning the facility where the materials had been discovered.
Marcus signed the agreements in a state of surreal calm. 43 years of invisible labor had culminated in a single morning of paperwork that would make him one of the wealthiest individuals in the state. The janitor who had been ridiculed for thinking he could buy a factory was now selling that same property for enough money to buy a dozen factories. But wealth, Marcus discovered, was only the beginning of transformation. Within days of the transaction's completion, he found himself facing choices that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Financial advisors courted his business with promises of investment strategies and estate planning. Real estate agents showed him mansions that could house small armies. Luxury car dealers offered him vehicles that cost more than most people's houses. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his entire adult life learning to find dignity in modest circumstances, satisfaction in simple accomplishments, meaning in work that others considered beneath them. Now he had resources that could purchase anything he'd ever wanted, but he found himself wanting many of the same things he'd always valued: honest work, genuine relationships, the respect that came from contributing something meaningful to the world around him. The answer came to him gradually, shaped by conversations with Patricia Reeves about philanthropic foundations and community development, discussions with Sarah Jennings about small business support and economic empowerment, memories of his parents' belief that success meant creating opportunities for others to succeed. Marcus established the Chen Foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million, focusing on 3 areas that reflected his personal journey: support for immigrant entrepreneurs, funding for adult education and career transition programs, and grants for small manufacturers and industrial startups. The foundation's offices occupied a renovated section of a factory in the industrial district where Marcus had spent his career, a deliberate choice that kept him connected to the community that had shaped his values. But perhaps more importantly, Marcus returned to work. Not the invisible maintenance work that had sustained him for decades, but consulting work that drew on his unique understanding of how buildings and businesses actually functioned from the ground up. Companies that wanted to improve efficiency, reduce costs, or better understand their operational foundations discovered that the former janitor possessed insights that no MBA program taught. The consulting work introduced him to Elena Rodriguez, a young entrepreneur trying to launch a sustainable manufacturing company in a renovated warehouse across town. She had the vision and energy that reminded Marcus of his younger self, but she lacked the capital and experience to navigate the complex challenges of starting an industrial business. Their partnership began as a mentoring relationship, Marcus providing funding and guidance, while Elena contributed innovation and passion. But over months of working together, designing production processes and building teams, Marcus found himself falling in love with someone who saw him not as a wealthy philanthropist or a successful businessman, but as a partner who understood that meaningful work was its own reward. Their wedding took place in the factory where Marcus had discovered his fortune, surrounded by friends and colleagues who represented every stage of his remarkable journey. Sarah Jennings served as Elena's maid of honor, having become one of Marcus's closest advisors in building the foundation. Patricia Reeves officiated, having been ordained online specifically for the occasion. Even Harold Pemberton attended, bringing a gift of industrial diamonds, legitimate ones, that Elena planned to use in her company's precision manufacturing processes. But the moment that meant the most to Marcus came when Miguel Santos, his old colleague from the janitorial crew, stood to offer a toast. "Marcus, you always told us that honest work had dignity, that taking care of things mattered even when nobody noticed. You never forgot where you came from, and you never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. That's the real treasure you found. Not diamonds, but the courage to become the person you were always meant to be."
As Marcus looked around the factory where his transformation had begun, he saw faces that represented every part of his journey. Immigrants pursuing their own American dreams, young entrepreneurs building the next generation of businesses, workers whose invisible labor kept society functioning smoothly. He had found wealth beyond imagination, but more importantly, he had found his place in a story larger than himself. The factory floor, where he'd once mopped in solitude, now hummed with activity from a dozen small businesses.
The hidden room where he'd discovered his fortune had been converted into a conference center where the foundation's board met monthly to review grant applications and strategic initiatives. The building that had symbolized corporate failure and abandoned dreams had become a symbol of renewal and possibility. Marcus Chen had spent 43 years being invisible, overlooked, and underestimated. But in the end, he had proven that the most valuable treasures weren't hidden in secret rooms. They were hidden in the human capacity for growth, perseverance, and transformation. His legacy wouldn't be measured in dollars or diamonds, but in the opportunities he created for others to discover their own hidden potential. The janitor, who had been ridiculed for dreaming too big, had become proof that in America it was still possible to dream too small. His story would inspire others to look beyond the limitations that circumstances imposed, to find dignity in honest work, while never stopping the search for something greater, to understand that the most profound discoveries often came not from seeking treasure, but from having the courage to claim the life you were meant to live. 5 years after Marcus Chen had first turned the key in the lock of an abandoned factory, he stood in the same spot where he discovered his impossible fortune, watching his 8-year-old stepson Carlos race between the gleaming new machines of Rodriguez Precision Manufacturing. The boy's laughter echoed through the space that had once held nothing but dust and secrets, a sound that seemed to exorcise the last ghosts of industrial decay and corporate failure. The factory had been transformed beyond recognition, yet somehow it retained the essential character that had first attracted Marcus to its possibilities. The soaring ceiling still stretched 40 feet overhead, supported by the same massive steel beams, but now skylights had been expanded and modernized to flood the space with natural light. The concrete floors, once stained with decades of oil and neglect, now gleamed with a polished finish that reflected the precision equipment Elena's company used to manufacture components for renewable energy systems. "Papa Marcus, watch this!" Carlos called out, using the name he'd adopted for his stepfather without prompting or ceremony. The boy was demonstrating his latest gymnastics move, a cartwheel that would have been impressive for someone twice his age, while Elena operated a computer-controlled cutting machine that transformed raw aluminum into wind turbine components with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The integration of family and business that defined their life together would have seemed impossible to Marcus just years earlier. But Elena had taught him that the American dream he'd inherited from his parents didn't require the kind of separation between work and life that driven his father to an early grave. Their factory operated on principles that honored both efficiency and humanity, creating products that helped save the planet while providing jobs that allowed workers to support their families with dignity.
But the success of Elena's company was only part of the factory's remarkable renaissance. The building now housed 17 different businesses, ranging from a small-batch brewery that had been founded by 2 former Meridian Industries engineers to a textile company run by a collective of immigrant women who specialized in traditional weaving techniques adapted from modern fashion markets. The hidden room where Marcus had discovered the diamonds had been converted into the Chen Foundation's main conference center, its walls now lined with photographs documenting the foundation's impact, images of scholarship recipients, successful business launches, community development projects that had transformed abandoned industrial sites into thriving commercial districts. The irony of hosting planning meetings for community renewal in the same space where government secrets had once been stored wasn't lost on Marcus, though he'd never shared that particular detail with anyone beyond Elena and Patricia Reeves. The Foundation's work had evolved far beyond Marcus's original vision. What had started as a simple desire to help immigrant entrepreneurs had grown into a comprehensive approach to economic development that addressed the systemic barriers preventing talented people from accessing opportunity. The Foundation now operated business incubators in 12 cities, provided microloans to over 300 small businesses, and had funded trade school programs that had graduated more than 800 workers into skilled manufacturing jobs.
But perhaps the initiative Marcus was most proud of was the Invisible Workers Project, a program that provided career transition support for custodial staff, security guards, food service workers, and others whose jobs made them effectively invisible to the people they served. The program had helped more than 200 people transition into skilled trades, business ownership, or supervisory roles, proving that the potential for transformation existed in every corner of the economy. Sarah Jennings had left Meridian Industries the year after Marcus's discovery to become the foundation's executive director, bringing her corporate experience to the challenge of scaling philanthropic impact. Her office occupied the same space where Marcus had once stored cleaning supplies, a renovation that amused them both. She'd proven to be a natural at identifying and nurturing promising social enterprises, with an intuitive understanding of how to balance idealistic goals with practical business requirements. "Marcus, we've got the quarterly impact report ready for your review," Sarah called from across the factory floor, waving a thick document that represented thousands of hours of careful measurement and analysis. The Foundation's board had insisted on rigorous data collection from the beginning, partly to ensure accountability, and partly because Marcus's experience had taught him that good intentions without measurable results were just expensive charity. The numbers in the latest report were staggering, even by the Foundation's ambitious standards. Their investments had helped create more than 4,000 jobs, generated over $200 million in economic activity, and supported business ventures with a collective success rate that exceeded industry averages by significant margins. But Marcus had learned to look beyond the statistics to the human stories they represented. Families lifted out of poverty, communities revitalized through thoughtful investment, young people discovering talents they never knew they possessed. One of those stories was playing out in real time at a workstation near the factory's eastern wall, where Maria Santos, Miguel's daughter, was training on a new piece of equipment that would qualify her for promotion to shift supervisor. Marcus had known Maria since she was a teenager, watching her struggle through community college while working part-time to help support her family. The Foundation's scholarship program had enabled her to complete an engineering degree, and Elena had hired her straight out of graduation. "Mr. Chen, the new quality control system is running perfectly. We're getting tolerance readings that are better than the manufacturer's specifications."
The pride in her voice reminded Marcus of his father's tone when discussing a particularly successful evening at the restaurant. The satisfaction that came from work done well, systems operating smoothly, products meeting standards that reflected both technical competence and personal integrity. It was a sound he'd heard less frequently in recent decades, as economic pressures and corporate consolidation had stripped dignity from many forms of productive work. Elena looked up from her design terminal, where she was working on blueprints for a new product line that would manufacture components for solar panel installations. At 34, she'd already established herself as one of the region's most innovative manufacturers, but she retained the curiosity and energy that had first attracted Marcus to her vision. Their partnership, both personal and professional, had evolved into something neither could have imagined when they'd first met in her struggling startup's warehouse space. "Carlos, mi amor, time to clean up for dinner," Elena called to her son, who was now engaged in what appeared to be an engineering project involving industrial zip ties and cardboard boxes. The boy had inherited his mother's mechanical aptitude, along with a fearless creativity that reminded Marcus of his own younger self, before decades of other people's limitations had taught him to moderate his ambitions. The family dinners they shared in the apartment Elena had designed above the factory office space had become the anchor of Marcus's new life. After decades of eating alone while watching television or reading technical manuals, the experience of sharing meals with people who cared about his thoughts and opinions still felt like a minor miracle. Carlos's enthusiastic descriptions of school projects, Elena's passionate explanations of new manufacturing techniques, the easy intimacy of conversation between people who had chosen to build a life together, it all represented a kind of wealth that no amount of money could purchase.
But tonight's dinner would be special, marking the 5th anniversary of Marcus's discovery and the official launch of the Foundation's most ambitious project yet. The Chen Institute for Practical Innovation would occupy a new building adjacent to the original factory, providing advanced manufacturing training, business development support, and research facilities focused on sustainable industrial processes. The institute represented Marcus's attempt to address what he saw as a fundamental gap in American economic development, the disconnect between theoretical knowledge and practical application that left both workers and businesses struggling to adapt to changing technological requirements. Students would learn not just how to operate advanced equipment, but how to maintain it, improve it, and integrate it into efficient production systems. "Papa Marcus," Carlos said as they walked toward the elevator that connected the factory floor to their living space. "Mrs. Jennings said you're going to make a speech tonight. Are you nervous?" The question made Marcus smile. Public speaking had never been one of his strengths. 43 years of invisible work hadn't provided many opportunities to develop presentation skills. But the boy's genuine concern reminded him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "A little nervous," Marcus admitted. "But I've learned that the most important things we do usually make us a little nervous. That's how we know they matter." The reception that evening brought together representatives from every part of Marcus's remarkable journey. Harold Pemberton had retired from Meridian Industries, but remained active on several foundation boards, his initial skepticism about Marcus's capabilities having evolved into genuine respect and friendship. Patricia Reeves served as the Foundation's legal counsel, her downtown office now complemented by a satellite practice focused on supporting small business development. Miguel Santos, now in his 70s but still working part-time as a building maintenance supervisor for one of the Foundation's tenant businesses, had brought his entire extended family to celebrate the Institute's opening. His granddaughter Rosa was beginning her sophomore year at MIT on a Chen Foundation scholarship, studying mechanical engineering with plans to return home and start a manufacturing business focused on medical devices. The gathering also included dozens of Foundation beneficiaries whose success stories had become case studies in effective philanthropy. There was David Kim, whose food truck business had grown into a restaurant chain employing more than 100 people. There was Sandra Williams, whose cleaning service had evolved into a facilities management company with contracts across 3 states. There was James Morrison, not the lawyer who once threatened Marcus's property ownership, but a former security guard who used Foundation support to become a certified industrial electrician and now ran his own contracting business.
But the speech Marcus delivered that evening wasn't focused on celebrating past achievements or announcing future plans. Instead, he spoke about something more fundamental, the recognition that every person possessed unrealized potential, that circumstances and expectations often prevented people from discovering their own capabilities, that meaningful change required both individual courage and systematic support. 5 years ago, Marcus began, looking out at the crowd gathered in the Institute's main hall. I was a janitor who spent my nights cleaning other people's offices and my days being invisible to the world around me. I thought I understood my limitations, accepted my place in the economy's hierarchy, and measured success by my ability to save enough money to survive retirement with modest dignity. He paused, making eye contact with faces that represented every stage of his transformation. But I learned something that changed everything. That the most dangerous limitations are the ones we accept without questioning, that the most valuable discoveries often come from having the courage to look beyond what others expect us to see, that the American dream isn't about achieving wealth or status, but about creating opportunities for everyone to become the person they're capable of being. The applause that followed was warm but brief. This wasn't an audience that came for speeches, but for the practical work of building better futures. As the evening continued with demonstrations of the Institute's equipment and discussions of upcoming programs, Marcus found himself reflecting on the improbable chain of events that had brought him to this moment. If he hadn't submitted that audacious offer to buy the factory, he would still be cleaning floors and emptying waste baskets, living a life of quiet dignity but limited impact. If he hadn't discovered the hidden room and its impossible treasure, he would never have acquired the resources necessary to create the foundation. If he hadn't chosen to use his wealth for community development rather than personal luxury, he would have remained isolated by his sudden fortune rather than connected to the larger purpose that now defined his days. But each of those choices had built upon the character his parents had tried to instill, the belief that honest work had dignity, that patient planning could overcome immediate disadvantages, that success meant creating value for others rather than simply accumulating resources for yourself. The diamonds had provided the means for transformation, but the values that guided that transformation had been forged during decades of invisible service and quiet struggle. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the Institute's lights had been dimmed for the night, Marcus and Elena walked through the factory one more time, checking systems and securing equipment with the careful attention that both had learned to bring to their work. Carlos had fallen asleep in the small apartment above the office, exhausted by the excitement of meeting so many interesting adults and hearing so many stories about his stepfather's remarkable journey. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found those diamonds?" Elena asked as they stood in the space where the hidden room had once been. The question had never occurred to Marcus before, perhaps because the discovery had become so central to his understanding of his own story. "I think I would have found a different way. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe not as fast, but I think I would have found a way to become the person I was meant to be. The diamonds gave me resources, but they didn't give me courage or wisdom or the ability to see potential where others saw problems. Those things came from somewhere else." Elena smiled, the expression carrying all the affection and respect that had grown between them over years of shared work and common purpose. "I think your parents would be proud of what you've built here, not just the foundation or the institute, but the life you've created. The way you've stayed connected to your values while embracing possibilities they probably never imagined." As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Marcus thought about his parents' photograph that still hung in their bedroom, Chen Wei-meng and Li Mei-hua standing in front of their restaurant, their faces bright with the hope that had brought them across an ocean in pursuit of opportunity. They had died before seeing their sacrifices bear fruit, but their legacy lived on in every scholarship awarded, every business launched, every worker trained, every family lifted into economic security through the programs their son's unexpected fortune had made possible.